Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest from the UK. His name is Dr. David A. Hughes, last name Hughges. We spoke in late 2022 about his paper or book, What is in the So-Called COVID-19, quote, vaccines, unquote, part one, evidence of a global crime against humanity. But he's just published a new book, full title, if you're watching this on Rockfin or X, is COVID-19, Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy. And it's volume one. And this is not going out on YouTube. This is like fully censored type material, but it's a very thorough book. It has great reviews already. On the front of the book, people are saying, one quote is, the most pressing issue today is for people to become cognizant of the deliberate drive for a global technocratic dictatorship. Dr. Hughes stands out as a rare, brave academic who's willing to go where few are willing to tread. Therefore, Dr. Hughes's book is a must-read for our times, and he dedicates the intro of this book to all who are actively resisting the global technocratic coup. And some people will be familiar with some of the topics that are in this book if you listen to my show. But just a little bit of background about Dr. Hughes. He has doctorates in German studies and international relations. He lectures on areas including security studies, international relations theory, foreign policy analysis, globalization, and U.S. exceptionalism. Probably should put that in quotes. But his research focuses on psychological warfare, 9/11, COVID-19, the deep state, intelligence, crime, technocracy, resurgent totalitarianism, and the class relations behind psychological operations. And a lot of the selections of his work can be found on academia.edu. So I'll put a link to his work. But he can talk more about his background and his new book. So Dr. David A. Hughes, welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you, William. Thanks for having me back.
Excellent. So for people who may not have heard our earlier conversation, which I will put a link to the show notes in this show, can you maybe talk about your background and what led up to the publication of this new book, COVID-19 Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy?
Yeah, well, I've long been interested in the power of psychological operations, particularly going back to 9/11, when the evidence of foul play is so stark and so obvious and so irrefutable. And yet, in my own profession, academics have refused to touch it for the best part of a quarter of a century now. And I've always found that remarkable. How's that possible to kind of hide the truth in plain sight and to manage to construct knowledge systems in such a way that the kind of elite knowledge networks, to use Inderjeet Palmer's phrase, that you get in academia, refuse to look at it. So I was already familiar from the 9/11 context with a good variety of kind of psychological operations and the kind of techniques that they can involve. Now, when the COVID crisis began, I saw straight away certain parallels, similarities between COVID and 9/11. For example, the rushed and pressured passage of the UK Coronavirus Act through Parliament in March 2020. A long document would have taken a long time to prepare, but nevertheless, it was all good and ready to go. Very similar to the passage, of course, of the USA Patriot Act in 9/11, just after 9/11, which, of course, was another long document that just conveniently was all ready to go. So I knew from the start that there was something deeply off and deeply fishy about this, and I kind of had a vague sense that techniques involving shock and stress and fear and trauma and so on were all being deployed. But I looked into it in a lot more detail, and it took me the best part of 3 years to put this book together. It's very detailed in terms of the amount of evidence it lays out. It's all carefully backed up by references, and it's been a lot of intellectual and emotional labor. But I'm proud to say that it is now out there, and I was also able to secure open access funding for this book, which means that it's freely available for your listeners to download if they would just do a quick search for the phrase "War for Technocracy." Usually the first result that comes back is a link to the Springer publishing site for the book. You can download it for free there, or individual chapters if you prefer. And because it's published under a Creative Commons license, you can also legally redistribute it for free.
Gotcha. That's great. And so I will put that link in so people can download it. But you also include references after every chapter so people can actually see your research in real time, right?
Yeah, it's all extensively sourced and referenced. There's probably at least 80 pages or so just of references in total. And it's all kind of hyperlinked up as well, so you can follow up the references very quickly.
And for maybe people, maybe a definition, a working definition of what is a technocracy? What's the history of it leading up to the present? Maybe.
Well, in very simple terms, it's the scientific management of society. As an ideology, it goes back to the 1930s, first formulated within the halls of Columbia University. The idea in that context, in the context of the Great Depression, it was about looking for an alternative economic and social system that wouldn't be prone to the booms and busts that you get in capitalism, where price is determined by supply and demand. So instead, what they proposed was that everything should be priced according to its energy cost of production and use, and that there would be an elite group, the technocrats, who would be able to oversee everything and manage everything. Now, the idea, that kind of ruling class ideal, dream, if you like, of being able to scientifically manage everyone and everything, never went away. For technological reasons, it wasn't ever going to be implementable back in the 1930s. But we can trace this way of thinking through ideas about a scientific dictatorship, as Huxley put it in the mid-20th century, or Brzezinski's idea of the technotronic era, as he called it, in 1970. We can look at Rockefeller funding into China over the course of many decades, helping to build up China into what Ian Davis calls the world's first technate, social credit scoring system, total surveillance, and so on. And it comes all the way now into the present, and the technology is now there in the form of anything called smart technologies. So trying to interlink everything from toasters to kettles to bollards to cars to smart meters, and even, I think, to human bodies now. So that's where we're at. They're trying to create a total technocratic control network. In chapter 8, I argue that the idea is to hook human bodies themselves up to this network. And if they succeed, then what we have here is a totalitarian control system based on biodigital means of control. And the potential for enslavement and evil is far beyond anything that Hitler or Stalin could have imagined. It's truly terrifying.
It really is. It's the Internet of Things. I mean, imagine like them hooking your body up to the internet, or it's just incomprehensible, the kind of the nightmarish world dystopia of dystopias, right? I mean, it's really incredible. But one of the interesting aspects of 9/11 and the whole COVID-19 element is the potency of what you call kind of negative or evil psychiatry, right? I mean, there's so many things they laid out or have been laying out over these decades that your book lays out all of these different aspects. It's really kind of an omni-war, like you write, psychological warfare, right?
For sure. So the scale of what they're trying to do is gigantic. Essentially, it's a top-down refashioning of the entire social order on a global scale. So the idea, certainly in the West, appears to be to collapse liberal democracy and replace it with global technocracy. Now, historically speaking, in order to effect such radical shifts in the social makeup, this is typically only possible through war and indeed world war, as we've seen on previous occasions. So I think what happened in 2021 was that the world's largest psychological operation ever was waged against populations transnationally, and that this was just the opening campaign in a much longer and wider war to effect the transition to technocracy. So typically psychological warfare is used historically as a means to kind of soften up or weaken a target population psychologically. It certainly had a great deal of success in demoralizing and disorienting and debilitating large numbers of people. Of course, a confident and healthy population would never accept the shift to technocracy, which they appear to be wanting to implement. And so you have to render the population sick, demoralized, passive, and willing to just kind of calmly go along with central bank digital currencies, social credit scoring, routine violations of bodily autonomy, injections with goodness knows what. I mean, it's really quite savage and quite brutal what's going on here. But part of the psychological operation is that large numbers of people don't see it or will not see it because of the sheer scale of the deception which has taken place, because their minds have been addled by techniques involving shock and stress and fear and trauma and attacks on cognition and so on. Volume 1 here deals with what Joost Meerlo in 1956 called menticide, by which he refers to that as the rape of the mind. So also in the 1950s, this is when the MK Ultra experiments were occurring, and Dr. Ewan Cameron was a key part of this, very senior in the psychiatry profession, I might add. And he came up with the concept of depatterning the mind. So in other words, if you want to achieve psychological control over somebody, first of all, you have to depattern their mind. You have to take its normal ways of working, all of the familiar patterns and operations, and completely addle them. Once that's been achieved, you can then reprogram the mind using all kinds of techniques involving hypnosis, repetition, indoctrination, and so on. So in volume 1 here, I'm focusing primarily on the techniques for menticide. And in volume 2, I intend to look at some of the techniques for reprogramming.
Right. So you see this kind of the research that they did back 50s and 60s being operational now, this called debility, dread. It's intentional. And then you eat out of the master's hand, right? I think that's what you and Cameron found is once you torture them enough, they basically become pliable. So they're really involved in psychologically torturing humanity. It's a global element. That's what's really kind of crazy is this triggering mass psychosis you write about. I mean, it's really something else. And you talk about the shock doctrine. That did you research the impact of the shock doctrine in the Chilean overthrow in '73? Is that what
Yeah,
that's based on?
that's all there in Naomi Klein's work. And what's interesting about her work is that she recognizes that this is a technique which is applied at the societal level in the interests of neoliberal disaster capitalism. But she's perfectly clear that the kinds of techniques that are used actually go back to the MK Ultra experiments. So all that's happened is we're no longer dealing with experiments on individuals. Increasingly, what, for example, the Tavistock Institute did in the mid-20th century was to find ways of applying these kinds of techniques to entire societies. They came up with the idea, for example, of what they called social turbulence, which is about kind of rolling series of shocks. So, for example, the oil price shock in 1973, followed by, let's say, the kind of Operation Gladio, false flag terrorism, and so on. And it means that the population is always kind of on edge. It can never properly adjust. And in that in that context, it becomes much more suggestible, much more malleable, much more open to propaganda and mind-based forms of social control.
Right. And that's what I found interesting in your book is you are using these kind of, we were talking in the pre-show about my research into hypnosis, but these are hypnosis terms, suggestibility, psychosis, triggers. And it's just incredible to think that they've implemented that against whole populations, millions and millions of people. And a lot of these people aren't, like you said, they're not cognizant of it, of this kind of suggestibility. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would, and that's a deliberate part of it. The cognitive dissonance, I've got a section in there about that as well. The reasons why people just cannot and will not see it. Of course, people who are in a state of shock or trauma can't properly integrate the experience of what's just happened to them into their ordinary experience. I think a lot of people are still under a kind of form of PTSD. Mary Holland of Children's Health Defence has argued this, that we've just lived through a period which was so traumatizing that most people now would rather just forget it and move on with their lives as best they can. But one of the points I make in the introduction to this book is that when that happens, victims remain locked in the orbit of their abusers, and the patterns of abuse can repeat. So, when we hear, for example, Bill Gates repeatedly warning of the next pandemic, as though there was a pandemic in the first place in 2020, there wasn't. You can see that these kinds of tactics could be used again. And what I find quite chilling about all of this is the sheer variety of tactics that were used. It's going to take me 2 long volumes to do justice to this. And the fact that they were all deployed simultaneously in the most coordinated of fashions, transnationally, down to a level of minute detail, which I try to lay out in the book. There is no way at all that any of this was by accident. This was all done on purpose. And I think the planning for this must have gone back for at least 2 decades, if not longer.
Yeah, it seems like they were working up to it with these other different SARS and all these other kind of viruses for the big assault that happened in 2020. Like I feel like that you're right, that they were working up to this huge thing. Everything had to be in place, and it's just an extraordinary event that we lived through or are living through. They're trying to re-implement all this stuff here in the States. I'm noticing along a political divide. So if you're on the left here, you're wearing masks and you're still watching TV news, but most of the people that I know aren't wearing masks. They saw through all this stuff. So it is kind of a weird kind of situation where some people are still under the mind control. It's literal mind control, and some people aren't. It's like the invasion of the body snatchers or something like that. It's really like surreal science fiction.
It is. What that's done as well. I deal with this in chapter 7 of the book, is to create deeply entrenched fundamental divisions throughout society. So I'm sure that everybody listening will most likely have lost friends or family over this issue. And I don't necessarily mean, that they passed away or whatever, but people refuse to talk to them, etc. And it kind of works both ways, unfortunately. And again, this is all by design, because in order to stop what's going on, there needs to be a kind of united front and class consciousness across society, and to recognize that there are instigators and there are perpetrators, and there's a tiny minority, really, a vicious cabal, which I think could probably be classed as psychopathic. It needs widespread recognition of what's happened here to be able to put a stop to what's coming next. And that's really the reason why I wrote the book. Unfortunately, the psychological operation was extremely successful in terms of its ability to divide society and to turn people against one another, even former friends, colleagues, lovers, etc. And this is a really terrible thing, because essentially society now appears to be divided into 2 main camps. You have those who, for whatever reason, can see through the propaganda and the psychological operations and all of the kind of measures which were done against them, and those who simply can't and will refuse to even engage on the topic. And that's a big problem that we've got at the moment.
It's incredible. It really is an incredible event, how it's broken up party lines and view lines and people who are afraid. And the mass fear and the paranoia was really just off the charts. Like people weren't, isolation too. That's a real important component in suggestibility and programming, is to make people isolated. And that's what they did in 2020. Like you couldn't go see your grandma in the old folks home or whatever. Like that's how bad it was. And it was really all baloney. It's just unbelievable.
Right. And that's a key point right there, that in order to be able to generate the excessive levels of fear that they did, chapter 4 is one of the longest chapters, and it's all about fear and threat and how this was generated. And in order to do it, they had to resort to lie after lie after lie after lie. And I suggest, indeed, totalitarian kind of big lies. Was there even a pandemic? I argue that there was not, in fact, a pandemic. There's no credible epidemiological evidence to support that contention. Were we really dealing here with a public health crisis? I don't think so. I think this was a coordinated deep state military operation from start to finish. Were the injections really about public health? I don't think so. I think they're, again, all about technocracy. I think, as I lay out in Chapter 8, they have a lot to do with moves to what planning documents as long ago as 2002 referred to as the IT bio-nano era. In other words, an attempt to use nanotechnologies to connect human bodies to an external network. And we know from all kinds of different documents that they've been working on this for at least 2 decades. Your listeners may also be interested to check out a 4-part series on transhumanism, which is coming out at the moment in Propaganda in Focus. The first 2 parts are out. This is a co-authored series that I'm doing with Lissa Johnson and Dan Brody. And again, it's to draw the public's attention to some of this military intelligence documentation, which has been available this whole time, but nobody's really looked. And when you see that, you can see quite clearly from a military perspective what the intention here is. And this would be an extraordinarily effective means of establishing social control at a time when the kind of post-1945 system of order is essentially finished. As Giorgio Agamben put it in 2020, the previous paradigm of control, for whatever reason, has been deemed not fit for purpose, and now they're looking for something else. And I think this biodigital technocracy is precisely what they're trying to issue in. But I will repeat, it's horrifying.
It's horrifying, and without consent, without information, without informing the public, these small group of people, in a very undemocratic way, are making decisions and using all these techniques. Kind of come out of the defense research, right? This whole psychological warfare is something we paid for to use against enemies, but it's been inverted against the population. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%. And when you look at the whole kind of phony war on terror and the phony pretext for the war on terror, what was it used to do? Well, not only wage illegal wars of aggression abroad, but also to implement ever tighter systems of surveillance and control at home. The measures at airports, for example, the increased number of CCTV cameras. And then in the meantime, they've managed to persuade everybody onto smartphones and social media, where everybody freely gives up their data. And ultimately, what this has enabled is a kind of a digital architecture whereby the switch can be flipped very quickly and is in the process of being flipped now, where those who were previously designated as terrorists and therefore could be subjected to a range of punitive measures, well, now it's simply those who are effectively dissidents and calling out the system, and they're deemed to be the new phrase is extremists. Previously, and still, they've used words like anti-Semites. Their speech is deemed to be harmful or hateful. And it's all completely inverted, because these are people who are trying to advance the cause of human freedom. But the enemy, unfortunately, is so devious and so capable of twisting and inverting everything that this is how it's being done. So I do also have another book coming out, incidentally, on the 4th of June called Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State. And the final chapter of that book, Chapter 8, that book essentially traces the parallels between what happened in 1930s Germany and what's happened in terms of the political economy of the West since 2020. I think it's all by design. I don't think any of this is an accident. They are trying to generate totalitarianism. But Chapter 8 of that book sets out where this all ultimately leads. There is a certain logic to this. And again, it's going to take us to some fairly terrifying places within a matter of years unless we stop it.
Right. And what do you predict? What do you foresee? I mean, we're basically kind of in World War III as it is. Israel, Ukraine, rumblings, and here in the States, they okayed in the Congress this crazy bill with $100 billion of support for these foreign conflicts. I mean, what do you see on the horizon?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and the outcome is always determined in the struggle. But what I do know is that essentially these global technocrats now have played their hand. The die is cast. So there is no going back now to anything that meaningfully resembles a liberal democracy. We simply have a kind of a husk of liberal democracy, an illusion to kind of fool the masses, a theatre, a charade, really. They will continue to dismantle democracy in real terms. For example, one law after the next being passed in the UK Parliament to clamp down on freedom of protest, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, etc. The path is very clear. And the rest of the population has no choice but to fight back against this because its freedom is on the line. So quite how that will play out going forwards, I don't know, but there has to come a point where those two forces, as it were, collide. So then it becomes very important to think about the kind of numbers that are involved. In the UK, by July 2022, when most of the attempt to inject the population had mostly passed, official figures from the UK Health Security Agency indicate that 23% of adults in the UK at that point had refused to take even one of these shots. Now, we know for a fact that the statistics and the data around anything COVID are always massaged and manipulated. So it's likely that that 23% figure is in fact higher and possibly much higher. So we might be looking at, let's say, a third of the population who by now have very serious doubts as to what's going on. Of course, we need that to be higher, but numbers are climbing all the time. The amount of damage, of course, done by the injectables is undeniable. Of course, there are some who still refuse to see it, but it's all over society. In terms of the official data, excess mortality rates in most Western countries have been consistently high since 2021. Not always the case during 2020, the so-called pandemic year. So there are all of these reasons to think that more and more people will start to become aware of what's really happening. The more people who speak out about this will accelerate the process. What we also have on our side is that once people do see it, there's no going back. You can't unsee it. So in other words, our numbers will only continue to climb. But how it's all going to end up, I honestly couldn't say.
Yeah, it doesn't look good. I mean, they're really going for censorship now. They're getting rid of here. They're trying to overthrow the First Amendment, literally, passing this kind of anti-Semite bill, whatever that means, whatever subjective that is. It's an astonishing series of legislation here in the United States.
Yeah, I might add on that the scale of the change here is of such a gigantic nature that essentially the ruling class is looking to overturn a tradition of liberalism which can be traced back for 2 or 3 centuries. I mean, typically the French Revolution is kind of seen as the kind of founding event of political modernity, if you like. And okay, back then it was republicanism rather than liberalism. But these ideals are very long-standing and very firmly entrenched in Western culture, and they're trying to overthrow all of that. So all ideas about freedom of any kind, as are enshrined in the US Constitution and Declaration of Independence, all of these things will have to go out the window, as they have been doing for some time. In fact, I mean, just think about drone attacks. The US has actually killed US citizens using drones simply because they were designated as terrorists. This is in stark violation of the Constitution. So the warning signs were there some years ago, and of course the Declaration is extremely clear that any government that becomes a tyranny means that the people have the right to rebellion. So the problem we faced here is it's not the government per se in any country which is the problem. It's the fact that these governments have been infiltrated and have become governments of occupation, and are now no longer acting on behalf of the people, but actually against them. And this is a deep problem. So I end this book by noting that if the Declaration still means anything to American patriots, it's very hard to see the status quo being maintained because, as I say, these opposing forces are increasingly coming together. So what will happen at that point? There's always the possibility of martial law, of course, an attempt to declare martial law. The plans for that going back through FEMA and the continuity of government arrangements that stem back to the 1950s. All of these arrangements, again, have been quietly put into place. So that's something which may be tried. And if it's attempted in the US, of course, it will be attempted transnationally. Will it succeed? I don't know, because there will be large numbers of people who will resist. So I think we are living through some genuinely historic times here.
Agreed. Like one of the most important times in history as we go. I've likened it to like a new age. Like we went from, Bronze Age, Iron Age, oil, information, and now it's like post liberalism into. I mean, it's hard to believe. It's this whole notion of progress is being turned on its head because we're regressing. And just like you said, these politicians like got to put in place. It's like they captured like an enemy, weaponized all the heads of government all around the world. Maybe not in Russia or maybe some odd places, but certainly in the US, like all the decisions that are being made here are against the population. It's extraordinary. And this is part of it. I mean,
Yeah,
and just
Western civilization, I think, is being deliberately plunged into crisis over this. As I say, the attempts to remake society in the interests of this tiny cabal of technocrats involve doing massive harm, really to pretty much all areas of society. And I'm sure everybody's seeing this in terms of what's happening to education, what's happening to healthcare provisions, what's happening to the state of politics, the fact that so many of the churches went along with the tyranny in 2020. These key institutions which are supposed to be propping up our society, the medical profession, of course, bears significant culpability for ignoring that kind of first do no harm principle. This is really deep-seated stuff, and again, it's not by accident. It's all being done on purpose against us.
yeah, it's incredible. And they financialized it to make money off of the tyranny and everything like that. Hippocratic Oath is gone, habeas corpus gone, 9/11. I mean, these are all these traditions that people should be really up in arms. That's the real protest that should be taking place. I mean, the genocide in Israel, in Gaza is really something else, but there's so many other issues going on right now.
Yeah.
And we haven't seen the full toll of the damages from the shot. Like, I don't know what nobody knows the long-term consequences of the DARPA shot. Like, this is something that came out of DARPA. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and this is precisely the issue, and this is why these things should never have been rolled out, because it's just basic, isn't it? That you don't introduce a new product like this to the market based on just a few months' safety data. It's literally impossible for anybody to know how safe they are in the longer term.
Right.
I mean, previously you'd be looking at 5, 10, 15 years for proper, adequately done clinical trials. So that was in itself deeply suspicious. I certainly realized this at the time, that the attempt to force a novel technology into as many people as possible, working down the age ranges all the way to children. I mean, there can be no sound scientific or moral justification for that. The purpose can only be nefarious. So what is it that they are really up to? And of course, the tragic thing is we can't say for sure. There have been all kinds of speculation around eugenics, around depopulation, around fertility, and fertility rates have dropped, incidentally, across many countries in the West. And as I suspect, a kind of military transhumanist project to connect human bodies to external networks. All of these things seem possible, but what I do know is that they lied to us about what's actually in the shots. It's a criminal offense, apparently, in the United States to actually investigate what's in the shots. That tells you all you need to know about how keen they are to cover this up. But nevertheless, just to hark back to our previous interview on my paper on the so-called COVID-19 vaccines, the 26 independent researchers and research teams whose findings I looked at in that paper, they all converge on some fairly horrifying findings, that there are all kinds of items in there that shouldn't be in there. Now that's primary empirical evidence. So, you can't look at something like that and ignore it. You have to ask, why is it this way? Why is it that one batch in every 200 is significantly more deadly than the rest? Is this part of a kind of worldwide experiment to kind of calibrate levels of tolerance to these products? Who knows? But the very fact that there are so many unanswered questions is highly disturbing, because it means that the regulators have completely failed us, governments have completely failed us, the mainstream media relentlessly has promoted all of this, and it's doing great damage.
Yeah, I mean, the estimates are like 20 million dead so far, and death rates are up 20%, birth rates are down, like you said. So something extraordinary happened. But look at it from their eye, like from Palantir or something, data mining, where they have these batch numbers and they know where they're going. It's almost like a James Bond movie. Like they
Yeah.
know which batches are going to which states in the US. There's supposedly higher death rates in certain states here, where other
Yeah.
whole, like in where I'm at, nobody's really gotten sick. Like in Los Angeles. Why? And because you hear of in other states, like whole families wiped out.
Yeah.
And that's all covered up. It's part of the psychological misinformation, disinformation, information warfare aspect of this
Right.
whole layout. Yeah, but it's
So
something.
in my next book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, among the many similarities that I unearthed there between 1930s Germany and what's happening today, one of them has to do with the sharing of public health data, the kind of collecting it all together in a centralized place and having it available to use essentially for eugenics purposes, kind of social and population planning purposes. They call it public health, but really we're dealing with a form of eugenics here. Now, when you think about the advances that have been made in human genomics, if you can collect that amount of data from everybody, and again, there are issues to be asked here about the swabs and the private companies that manufactured the swabs and what they did with that data. When you look at the fact that a reported 5.55 billion people took one or more of these injections, with the kind of how bad is my batch scenario also factoring into this, it does look very much like an experiment on a massive scale, a medical experiment on a huge scale. This is completely unacceptable. But again, there have been warnings as to where this could ultimately lead from a military perspective. There was a guy at West Point, Charles. What's his surname? Damn it, I've forgotten his surname. I'm sure your listeners will find it. He gave a talk in 2018 at the West Point Academy, and he noted there that in principle, if you can gather so much genetic information on people, it would be possible to develop a biological weapon of some kind, which could be so targeted and so precise that it could kill precisely one person. It could target them specifically. So, again, the potential here for what this could be leading to, and part of it is that the one thing I've discovered through doing this work is no matter how bad you think it is, it's always worse. The further you keep digging. So again, this is why I've kind of chosen to write this book, and just to lay out the facts and the evidence. It's not an easy read. I warn the reader in the introduction. This is not something to be taken lightly. It is a kind of a form of anamnesis. Recalling events that happened in a traumatic context. It's emotionally difficult work, but I think it's very necessary work if we are to properly confront the scale of the evil which we are now facing.
Yeah, it's truly evil. I think it's James Giordano. Is that right? Does that sound right?
It
At
wasn't
West
him.
Point?
Giordano did also give some very important talks at West Point, but no, the other guy was definitely Charles someone, but I can't remember his surname.
But Giordano's talks, I mean, he scares me. Like his knowledge base is so broad. Like this is like the technocrats, like weaponized magician or something. Like that guy knows everything about like psychology. Like, well, that
Yeah.
speech was scarier than like a seat for me. Like I would rather listen to Anton LaVey than Charles Giordano because like, whoa, it's terrifying.
Yeah, I do cite him a couple of times in this book. He talks about creating an quote an army of the worried well, And this is kind of basically appealing to kind of hypochondriacs and others in society, where all you have to do is just tell them that there is a threat or that something has been released. And there will be a large number of people in society who will automatically think that it's real, will automatically think that they may have got it, will automatically start kind of acting ill, or maybe if they've just got a cold or something, or the flu, they kind of mistake that for it. And again, this is how it's done. It's all been carefully calibrated, going back many years.
Right. Yeah. And I think his talk was the brain is the battlefield of the future or something. So it's all
Yeah,
it's
so
all
I refer I
things.
refer back to that in chapter 8, where I'm trying to convey the potentially horrific implications of what would happen if they do succeed in these projects, for which there is a lot of evidence, which I present, to be able to interfere with the human body through external networks plus technologies within the body. Now, the way it's been presented and marketed is always very positive in terms of kind of healthcare developments. Look what we might be able to do to help with Parkinson's or cancer, and so on. But nobody seems to have asked the question, what if this is dual use technology? What if all of these academics and other researchers who have helped to develop this technology simply haven't considered that it could be appropriated by very bad actors for very nefarious purposes? And so, for example, I make reference in chapter 8 to the remote control beetle. And they managed to basically put some kind of technology inside a beetle, and they could control the movement of its legs, just externally using a computer. It's really horrifying. Potential to remotely target people for assassination using this technology, or even to remotely torture them. It's incredibly grim when you think what could be done and how total the possibilities are here for control. And
Right.
people need to face up to this, rather than imagine that this is just the stuff of sci-fi, or that this is the product of kind of a paranoid imagination. They always like to dismiss people who ask critical questions as kind of psychologically deficient in some way. Oh, you must be paranoid or whatever. But no, the evidence is all set out there in some detail in this book, and I would implore readers to have the bravery to take it on and really reflect on what it really means.
Right. And just because people aren't thinking about it doesn't mean that your leaders aren't thinking about it. They're the ones thinking about all this stuff. Behavioral science, all these guys like Cass Sunstein and all these guys are involved in that. And we're involved in like this kind of new world order stuff. Like Cass Sunstein and his wife and these people are all studying behavioral science to implement it, right? To nudge or some kind of thing. That's what they think about. So it's important that the citizenry of the world understands this and all these themes that you've included in your book.
Yeah, and again, the deep state here, I think, is really important to think about, because I think very often it's the case that many of these kind of public figureheads actually have no idea what they're doing or what it is that they're part of. If you look at something like the Health Secretary Matt Hancock, as he was then during the COVID era, he's responsible for a lot of very bad things, including the Midazolam scandal and the attempt to legitimize euthanasia in this country. But even then, I get the impression that he's really a fairly immature kind of guy, and he simply wants to achieve wealth and power by doing the bidding of very powerful actors. Photographed of Klaus Schwab, for example, and Bill Gates and others. I don't think that someone like that would have any real clue as to what his real purpose was in terms of the bigger picture of what's taking place here. And similarly, you mentioned behavioral psychology. I mean, some of the ways that when you look at the SAGE minutes in this country, that's the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, they were informed by a group called SPI-B, were putting forward some of the behavioral psychology tactics. And it wouldn't surprise me if, for at least some of them, they honestly thought that this makes sense in the context of an alleged pandemic. So, there's a famous line in there from the spring of 2020 about something like the public doesn't feel sufficiently threatened. Now, maybe they honestly thought that you need to apply more fear and threat to be able to deal with a global public health emergency. Maybe to many of these people, it would be simply incomprehensible that they have been co-opted and turned into instruments of psychological warfare, or take the decision to lock down in the UK. Who made that decision? Because days before the 23rd of March, which was the UK lockdown date, multiple senior figures in the government and in SAGE were saying, no, there's no need to lock down. There's no need to lock down. SAGE then closed down for 4 days between the 19th and the 23rd. There's nothing in its minutes about this. And then all of a sudden, the country's locked down. So who took this decision? Because that to me looks very much like a deep state operation again. And there was a very interesting anecdote I heard from Bob Moran, the cartoonist, who was talking. I think it was a former editor of his at the Telegraph, who had he was in a meeting with Boris Johnson and also with Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, the chief medical officer and science officer at the time. And at the end of the meeting, Whitty and Vallance left the room, and this editor was left alone with the Prime Minister. And he said to the Prime Minister, according to Moran, surely you're not going to do this. Surely you're not going to lock down the country. And apparently Johnson replied, a worried-looking Johnson replied, "I have to do what they tell me." So who's really in charge here?
Wow.
It's so in other words, the control networks are very hidden. They're very deep. Or look to Parliament. The amount of I've got a section in the book called "Perpetrators in Parliament," because every time there was a vote to renew the lockdown or enforce other harmful measures on the population, Parliament passed it every time, even when there was concrete evidence and reason not to do so. So we have to ask the questions: how many of these people are bullied, blackmailed, brainwashed? To what extent? Because they clearly are no longer serving the people. So I think there's some very, very interesting questions to be asked in terms of who's actually running our countries and how.
Well said. I think it's the same thing in the United States. They kind of went along with it, and they're still going along with these strange wars. And even our speaker here, Speaker of the House Johnson, he publicly said, "There's no way I'm going to support these wars, and I'm not going to fund this." And then he went into some kind of secret compartmentalizes informational thing and came out like he saw Jesus and said, "We're passing this," and with the collusion of his so-called enemies in the other party, in the Democratic Party. It's unbelievable. So who's puppeteering these guys? They're not independent. And a lot of these guys get money. It's not just like, APAC or something like that. They get money from all kinds of things, defense people. So it's very, Americans, global population should be terrified of their leaders, but Americans in particular, maybe even the UK,
yes, well, transnationally, this is the point. It's all been done transnationally, and the fact that even the same slogans like "Build Back Better" are being used, by politicians across all countries, or phrases like "the new normal," they were all acting as one. And I think when you lay out the evidence, as I have done in this book, they were all acting as one against their own populations. So, this is a historically unprecedented moment that we are in here. This kind of thing has never happened before. So quite what the response of the global population will be, I don't know. But I think we're into for some very interesting times.
Right. What happens if the citizens do not believe in the legitimacy of their government? Those are the revolution. You talk about the French Revolution. Same thing happened, right? Louis the 16th, or was Louis the last, right? And the same kind of attitude too, like the same kind of like it let them eat cake attitude. Like, who cares? They don't care. I can tell you the U.S. population, they don't care at all about the people in the U.S. government. So actually, hatred is probably more close. Contempt.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like, why am I paying taxes? I'm paying 40% taxes for this kind of service. What?
Right.
So that's a scary thing, is like when people stop trusting, whether it happens in France or Russia Or, I mean, think about all these other revolutionary situations. Like,
Yeah, and I mean, in that respect, it's no coincidence that was it the latest Davos meeting? The theme was rebuilding trust, because
right.
they know that it's gone. Trust in the media and in politics. I mean, it's understandably at an all-time low. And again, what that means going forwards, I mean, certainly we're going to be in for a system shift one way or the other. And either they get their global technocracy, or we get a system which is more conducive to human flourishing and the well-being of humanity.
Well said. That's a great way to end it. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to add, David, before we wrap it up? We're at the 50-minute mark.
Yeah. So just to just plug a few things. So as I say, if readers want the free download of this book, just do a search for War for Technocracy. Should help you find it. If you don't find it there, you can find it on my academia.edu page. I would mention that 3 years of very hard work, intellectually and emotionally, went into this book, and I don't receive a penny for it. I get nothing in royalties, nothing in fees at all. So this was done kind of in service of humanity, really. So I would urge readers, if you do find something of value in this book, to please give something back financially. I've got to buy me a coffee at the moment. buymeacoffee.com/DA Hughes. If you go to my academia.edu, there are other ways of supporting me. I'll just add a note on my personal situation at the moment. 6 days after this book was published, I was told that I am at risk of redundancy. There's no direct correlation between the two, but there is now a very realistic chance that I will lose my job alongside 220 colleagues at the university. If that does happen, I'm really going to need the public support to help continue to do this kind of work. This here is volume 1. I already have begun volume 2. I already know exactly where I want it to go, but it may be that I require some backing to do that. So again, if there's anybody out there who can help with a donation which is larger than just a coffee or two, please get in touch with me, dhughes@lincoln.ac.uk. I'd be really interested and grateful to hear from anyone who might be able to do that. Otherwise, please do share this work. You said it's never going to go on YouTube. Social media is shadow banning the hell out of it. One of the reasons I was delighted to be able to get the open access funding here was that the whole thing is available as a single PDF download. So do email it to people, share it around in your networks in other ways. Don't just rely on Facebook and Twitter and so on. Do try and get the word out there. I am also trying to set up a website, which will be omniwar.org. It's not live yet, but it should be soon. And I'm also going to start a Substack, which will be at DA Hughes. So if your listeners want to follow me, there's multiple means there. But as I say, I'd be very grateful for some support at this stage, because I'm in a bit of a difficult situation.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, it's people are trying to figure out how to get through this whole situation one way or the other. It's very turbulent, but I hope that you land on your feet. Again, the author is Dr. David A. Hughes, in the book we talked about, which is free in a PDF, and I will put a link to his Buy Me a Coffee and Substack in the show notes. The full title is COVID-19 Psychological Operations and the War for Technology, Volume 1. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, William. I appreciate it.
All right, stay there.